Now we head to ancient Celtic lands, places like Ireland, Scotland, and Gaul. In these tribal societies, marriage was flexible, deeply spiritual, and tied to the natural world. Unlike the strict systems in Rome or China, Celtic marriage was more about choice, respect, and balance. A Celtic wedding wasn't just about the people. It was a bond between families, land, and the gods. The ceremony was often held outdoors, during seasonal festivals like Beltane, the fire festival of summer, and fertility. Couples would jump over flames or pass between bonfires to show their union was blessed by nature. Marriage could be monogamous or polygamous, depending on your status. A powerful man might have multiple wives, but each relationship had to be based on clear rules and mutual respect. Women had legal rights. They could own land, start divorce, and choose their husbands. In some tribes, couples had a trial marriage. They lived together for a year and a day. If it worked out, great. If not, they could part ways without shame. Marriage contracts often included agreements about property, inheritance, and duties. If a spouse was abusive or neglected their family, it could be grounds for separation. The focus was on partnership, not control. Celtic marriages were not about kings or law codes. They were about shared responsibility, spiritual connection, and staying in harmony with the world around you. Now let's jump far forward in time to medieval Europe, at one of the greatest castles ever built, Malbork Castle in what is now Poland. It started not as a royal palace, but as a base for warrior monks known as the Teutonic Knights. These knights were part soldier, part priest. They fought in the Crusades, but soon left the Holy Land and settled in northern Europe. They came to convert pagans and stay in power. In 1274, they began building Malbork, a massive red brick fortress on the Nogget River. Malbork was more than walls and towers. It was a symbol of faith and force. Inside, it had chapels, meeting halls, and rooms. For knights, every brick was laid with purpose. Even the bathrooms had smart designs. Waste was washed away by river water. The knights ruled like kings. They had their own laws, taxes, and armies. Malbork became the heart of their empire. But empires make enemies. In 1410, the combined forces of Poland and Lithuania defeated the knights at the Battle of Grunwald. Their grandmaster was killed. Their power shook, but Malbork didn't fall right away. It survived a siege. It stayed strong. Still, the order weakened. By 1457, the knights were so broke they sold the castle to the Polish king. Malbork became a royal residence. No blood, no battle, just money. Time moved on. The castle saw new rulers and new wars. In the 1600s, Sweden invaded Poland. Malbork fell again, this time with no defense. Soldiers looted treasures, broke walls, and left behind ruins. Then came the Prussians. They turned parts of the castle into warehouses and military barracks. They even tore down walls for building materials. The once great fortress faded into silence, but it never disappeared. In the 1800s, a wave of national pride brought new interest. In medieval history, architects began restoring Malbork. Some parts were rebuilt with care. Others were guessed or romanticized to look dramatic. Malbork became a museum of the past, especially for Germany. Then came World War II. The castle was bombed by Soviet forces. Fires destroyed much of what had been restored. But after the war, Poland reclaimed Malbork. They started rebuilding it again, this time with a focus on accuracy and care. Today, Malbork is the largest brick castle in the world. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. School groups visit. Historians study its walls. Tourists walk its courtyards, wondering how it survived centuries of war, fire, and politics. Malbork doesn't offend anymore. It remembers. Final thoughts, threads that tie it all together, whether it's a geisha kneeling in a quiet room, a bride jumping over fire in Celtic lands, or a queen walking through castle gates. One thing connects all these stories: tradition, discipline, and quiet strength. Across thousands of years, cultures have built systems to guide marriage, power, and identity. In some places, women were symbols. In others, they were leaders. In some homes, love was a gift. In others, it wasn't expected at all. But in every culture, we see the tension between duty and desire, between public role and private self. The geisha who smiles through pain, the wife who carries the family legacy, the warrior bride who tells her husband to die with honor. These are stories of performance, survival, and elegance. And in the end, the quiet gestures matter most. The way A fan opens, the way a bow is held, the way someone walks without sound. Those moments last, because even when names are forgotten and buildings fall, traditions leave footprints in teacups, in old poems, in castle stones. And somewhere, a girl kneels on aching legs, smiles just enough, and carries all of it forward. The Vikings lived in one of the coldest places in Europe's Scandinavia. Winters there were long, dark, and extremely cold. There was no electricity, no heaters, and no cozy bedrooms. But the Vikings were strong and clever people. They didn't panic when snow covered the land. Instead, they had smart ways to survive. When winter arrived and temperatures dropped dangerously low, Vikings moved into their longhouses. These were large buildings made of wood if trees were nearby, or turf and stone if not. They were built low to the ground to trap heat and had enough space to fit several families, in some cases. Even cows or goats stayed inside with the people. That might sound strange today, but it was actually useful. Animals gave off heat and helped warm the space. This wasn't about comfort. It was about staying alive inside a Viking longhouse. Life was crowded and smoky. A fire pit sat in the middle of the room and burned all day and night. It was used for cooking and heating, but there were no chimneys to let the smoke out, so it filled the room. Some smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, but much of it just floated around or stuck to the ceiling, turning it black. Breathing was hard, and people probably coughed often, even though the smoke was unpleasant. The heat from the fire from everyone's bodies helped them stay warm. The longhouse became like a big thermal blanket made out of people, animals, and fire. People slept on raised wooden platforms built along the walls. These platforms were stuffed with straw, moss, or whatever soft materials they could find. Families lay side by side, fully dressed, including goats or chickens nearby. It wasn't about love or closeness, it was about using body heat to survive. No one had privacy. Everyone breathed the same smoky air, but it worked. They stayed warm enough to make it through the night. Viking clothes were not designed to look good. They were made to keep people from freezing. The Vikings were masters at layering their clothes. First came a layer of linen if they could afford it. Linen was light and good at pulling sweat away from the body, but it was hard to make and expensive. Most people wore wool instead. Wool was warm, even when it got wet. Viking men wore wool tunics and pants. They wrapped their legs in long strips of cloth to stay warm. It was like wearing thick, old-fashioned leggings. Women wore long wool dresses with aprons and thick cloaks. Everyone wore belts to hold tools, small pouches, or food like dried cheese. Cloaks were fastened with metal pins and sometimes lined with fur. If you didn't have a cloak, you were in danger. Viking boots were made from animal skin, often cow or seal. They rubbed animal fat on the boots to make them waterproof. These boots weren't stylish, but they kept feet dry and warm. Some Vikings even used clean animal intestines to make waterproof coats. That may sound disgusting, but it kept out snow and rain. No one laughed at you for wearing it because it worked. Hats, mittens, and scarves were made of wool that was beaten until it became thick and warm. If you didn't have gloves, you just put your hands inside your cloak and hoped your fingers didn't turn blue. Food was also a big part of Viking survival. During winter, their meals weren't fancy or delicious. They were heavy, greasy, and meant to give the body fuel to stay warm. Vikings ate a lot of meat, dairy, grains, and preserved fish. They smoked, salted, dried, and even fermented fish to make it last through the season. One dish, called lutefisk, was made by soaking white fish in lye. It wasn't tasty, but it could last a long time without going bad. For big meals, they made stews. They put whatever they had into a pot meat, root vegetables, oats, and sometimes sour milk that's cooked for hours over the fire. It was thick, simple, and filling. Cheese and butter were made during the warmer months and saved for winter. These weren't soft cheeses. They were hard, salty, and tough to chew, perfect for trading, eating, or even throwing at wolves. Another dairy food was skyr, which was something between yogurt and cheese. It was sour and full of protein. Not everyone liked it, but it kept you strong. Grains were very important too. They stored barley and rye in large amounts. These were used to make flatbread and porridge. Sometimes they even added crushed tree bark to stretch the flour supply. Bread was dark, dense, and tough, but it gave energy. Vikings also drank alcohol during winter. Ale and mead were very common. These drinks were full of calories and helped people feel warmer. Mead, which was made from fermented honey, made long winter nights a little more cheerful. even if it didn't taste great. It made you forget how cold and uncomfortable life was. It was also safer to drink than dirty water. One clever Viking trick was using animals as heat sources. Vikings didn't see anything strange about letting livestock into the house. In fact, it was very smart. Cows, pigs, goats, and chickens were brought into the longhouse to sleep in a section called the byre. This part was usually separated from the people by a low wall. The animals didn't stay inside for cuddles, they were there to produce warmth. A cow gave off as much heat as a small fire. On freezing nights, people might move closer to the animals. Children could sleep next to a sheep if the ox was warm and didn't mind. You could use it as a pillow. Of course, there were problems too: noise, smells, and the risk of getting stepped on. But Vikings didn't complain. They knew that animals inside meant staying alive. This setup also kept the animals safe from cold, wild predators, or thieves. Livestock were valuable. They gave food, milk, and warmth. In many cases, longhouses were built to move heat from the animal section toward the living area. This was smart design, simple, effective, and a bit smelly inside the smoky longhouse. People huddled together for warmth. Families lay side by side on wooden platforms with animal skins and wool cloaks as blankets. Children slept between adults, not for love, but for warmth. Dogs and cats were not treated as pets, they were heat sources. Privacy didn't exist. Everyone breathed the same smoky air that smelled like sweat, cabbage, and livestock. Uncle Bjorn snored like a dying bear, and no one pretended not to notice. But this wasn't just about warmth. It was about staying sane too. Winters were long and boring. If people didn't laugh or joke, they might go crazy. So the Vikings made fun of each other. They told stories, sang songs, and teased one another to pass the time. They even roasted each other with harsh jokes, especially during long nights when everyone was stuck indoors. Nothing helped fight sadness like laughing at your cousin for falling into the latrine last week. During midwinter, Vikings held feasts to lift everyone's spirits. These feasts used food saved from the fall. They celebrated a festival called Yule, where people gathered around fires, told stories, and gave thanks for surviving the cold so far. It was a chance to feel happy and hopeful. Games, competitions, and storytelling filled the time. Some Vikings wrestled inside the longhouse, which sometimes caused chaos, but it helped everyone forget how dark and cold it was outside. The most important thing was that no one faced winter alone. Everyone helped each other, sharing food, stories, blankets, and jokes. That's how they made it through. Viking winter survival was not about comfort. It was about teamwork, preparation, and toughness. They didn't expect life to be easy. They expected it to be hard, and they were ready. They built thick walled longhouses, wore heavy wool clothes, and brought animals inside. They ate heavy food and slept fully dressed. They didn't complain, they laughed, worked together, and stayed alive. In the end, they didn't just survive winter, they faced it head on, together, with stubborn strength and smoky determination. Vikings didn't have the insulation materials we have today like fiberglass or foam. They had to make do with what was around them. Their homes weren't drafty by accident, they were designed with survival in mind. The main goal was to trap as much heat as possible and stop cold wind from getting in. The walls of Viking longhouses were made thick, often up to a meter wide. Depending on where you lived, these walls were built from timber, or if there were no trees nearby, they were made with turf and stone to keep the heat in. The spaces between the wooden beams or stones were packed with anything soft and warm: moss, straw, mud, or even animal hair. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. It kept the wind out and the warmth in. The roof was also part of their insulation system. Vikings often used turf or thatch roofs made from straw. Turf roofs were literally layers of dirt and grass placed on top of the house. They helped keep heat inside and also stopped rain or snow from coming through. If you were lucky, you might even get weeds or mushrooms growing on your roof, not on purpose. But it was kind of like having a wild garden up there. The floor of the longhouse was usually just packed down dirt. In some places, they added layers of straw or dry grass called rushes. These were changed out from time to time, not often, just whenever the smell became too bad to ignore. The longhouses had very few windows, and if they existed, they were tiny. Most houses didn't use glass because it was expensive and not very useful in such dark winters. Instead, they got light from the fire or small holes in the roof that also let smoke escape. These homes may have looked rough, but they were clever, with thick walls, animal heat, and a smoky fire at the center. The Viking longhouse was like a slow cooker for people. It wasn't luxurious, it wasn't clean, and it definitely wouldn't pass modern safety inspections. But it did its job. It kept people warm enough to survive. Sleeping in these homes was another matter. It wasn't like today, where everyone has their own room and soft bed. Viking families, along with maybe a sick goat or two, slept together. On those raised platforms along the wall, the bedding was made from straw, hay, or moss, with layers of wool or animal skins piled on top. If it was soft and didn't stink too badly, it was used. People didn't change into pajamas, they slept in their clothes. Taking off your layers in freezing weather was a good way to get sick or freeze, so you just stayed dressed, sometimes even with your boots on. Infants were bundled tightly and held close for warmth. Children were placed between adults, not for cuddles, but because it was the warmest spot. If someone had cold feet, they pressed them against someone else. It wasn't considered weird. It was called not dying. There was no privacy. If your feet wandered over to someone else during the night, no one cared. Survival came before manners. The wealthier Vikings might have had heated stones or bricks that were placed under the bedding to add warmth. These worked like old-fashioned hot water bottles, except heavier and more likely to burn you. And if the fire went out during the night, people didn't rush to restart it. Instead, they pulled someone closer and hoped to make it till morning. The smoky air made everything harder. In theory, the smoke was supposed to go up and out the roof, but in practice, it just sat in the air, floating down and getting into everyone's lungs. Breathing was like inhaling firewood. People probably woke up coughing. With red eyes and heavy chests, the kids and elderly suffered the most, since they were shorter and closer to the thickest part of the smoke cloud. Still, the smoke had a few benefits. It preserved food and meat that hung from the rafters. It also kept insects and mold away, so while it may have been terrible to breathe, it helped keep the food fresh and the bugs at bay. Some Viking homes, especially among the richer families, had special holes in the roof to let the smoke out. But for most people, smoke was just part of life. It seasoned their food, warmed their bones, and reminded them every day that fire was both a gift and a danger. If the smoke got too thick, they opened the door, but doing that meant freezing, so most people just coughed and dealt with it. As the days got shorter and colder, and the sun barely came out at all, the Vikings turned to one of their oldest tools, celebration. When it's dark for weeks at a time, your mind can suffer. People get sad, tired, and hopeless. So the Vikings fought the darkness with fire, food, and fun. They held a festival called Yule during the midwinter season. This wasn't just a party, it was a way to survive emotionally. People lit huge fires that symbolized the sun and gathered for meals and games. The bigger the fire, the better. These flames were like a challenge to the long nights. They dared the cold to come closer. The Vikings didn't have electric lights or cheerful music. They had meat, mead, and very loud voices. During Yule, families shared the food they had saved since fall. Preserved meat, old bread, strong cheese, and mead were served. People sang, told stories, and played games. These games were more than just fun, they were a distraction. Riddles, board games, and even wrestling matches helped pass the time. Sometimes people would drink so much that they forgot how cold and hopeless the season felt. The Yule log, which today might be a dessert or decoration, was originally a huge real log burned for many days. It stood for warmth, survival, and hope. The longer it burned, the more people believed the sun would return. There were also spiritual reasons for Yule. Vikings believed that winter was when ghosts, trolls, and restless spirits roamed freely. People made offerings, said prayers, and did rituals to keep bad spirits away. They even decorated with evergreen plants to symbolize life and protection. These traditions might sound familiar, and they should. Many modern Christmas traditions come from Yule. Gift giving, decorating trees, and big family meals all started with Norse celebrations. But most of all, Yule was about being together. When the sun disappeared for weeks and the cold seemed endless, the Vikings didn't go quiet. They gathered around the fire, laughed, argued, shared food, and survived together. What played a huge role in all of this, it might sound strange, but for the Vikings, what was more valuable than gold? It was their main defense against the cold, second only to fire. They made everything out of wool cloaks, tunics, socks, mittens, even underwear. Wool was better than other fabrics because it stayed warm even when wet. This was important in a place where it snowed and rained constantly. Every farm had sheep, not for cuteness or cheese, but for their wool. Spinning wool was a job done by women and children year-round. In the winter, it became even more important. Every thread turned into a layer of warmth. Vikings didn't dress to look fancy, but they knew how to make clothing that worked. Tunics were cut to fit well. Cloaks were shaped so people could move easily. Leg wraps were tied carefully so no one tripped. The quality of your wool also showed your social status. Coarse, rough wool meant you were poor or practical. Fine, soft wool meant you had money. If your cloak was dyed in color, especially blue or red, you were rich. Most people wore natural shades of sheep, gray, brown, off-white, and black. They also made felt, which was wool that had been soaked and beaten until it became a thick mat. Felt was used for hats, mittens, boots, and even wall insulation. It wasn't pretty, but it was warm. Wool clothing was repaired and reused over and over again. Cloaks were passed down through generations unless they were burned, lost, or buried with someone. Even small scraps were used to make socks or stuffing. Vikings knew how to get the most out of everything they had. Oddly enough, some of the coldest people in history were also fans of getting even colder. The Vikings loved saunas and ice baths. That's right, they would sit in hot, smoky steam rooms, then run outside and jump into freezing water or roll in the snow. Why would they do that? Partly to show off, but also for health reasons. These sweat lodges, called batstofa, were small buildings made with stone and turf. Inside, hot rocks were splashed with water to make steam. People sat inside, sweating buckets, while the world outside was frozen solid. Then, once their bodies were hot, they dashed outside into the snow. This extreme hot-cold routine was believed to cleanse the body and make people stronger. It helped circulation, cleared sinuses, and temporarily made people forget they lived. In a cold, smoky house with a cow, these saunas also brought people together. Families would sit inside together, sweating and talking. Sometimes it was used as a healing space or even a birthing room. If something needed fixing, an illness, a bad mood, or a sore muscle, the answer was usually heat and steam. Modern Nordic countries still follow this tradition. They love saunas, though they usually leave the goats out these days. The Vikings didn't survive winter by accident. They worked, planned, joked, and shared their way through the cold. They expected it to be hard. They didn't ask for comfort, they just made the best of what they had. Whether it was stuffing moss into their walls, eating cheese that doubled as a weapon, or sleeping next to a snoring pig, they did what they had to do, and somehow they not only survived, but kept their spirits alive too. While Vikings were good at fighting the cold, they also had to fight boredom. Winters in Scandinavia were not just freezing, they were also very long and dark. For months, the ground was frozen, the sky was gray, and there was little to do outside. You couldn't sail, you couldn't farm, and you couldn't raid. You were stuck inside a smoky, crowded longhouse with your family, your neighbors, and probably a few animals. If you didn't find ways to keep busy, you might go stir crazy or start fighting with your relatives. The Vikings were practical, but they were also clever. They found many ways to keep their hands and minds occupied during the long winter months. The first way they stayed busy was by doing repairs and preparation. Winter was the perfect time to fix things. Vikings repaired their tools, sharpened their weapons, and patched their clothes. If a shirt had a hole in it before winter, you'd better fix it before your arm froze. They used bone needles and wool thread to mend tears in tunics, cloaks, and socks. Nothing was thrown away if it could be repaired. Tools like axes, knives, and farming equipment were cleaned and sharpened by the firelight. Vikings also made new items during this time. They carved wood into spoons, bowls, and handles. They shaped bone into needles, buttons, and combs. Even antlers were used to make tools or decorations. People made soap from ashes and fat, and they might even fix broken furniture. Winter wasn't a time to be lazy, it was a time to get ready. For spring, spinning and weaving wool was one of the most common winter tasks, especially for women and children. Spinning turned raw wool from sheep into thread, and weaving turned thread into cloth. This process took hours and hours of quiet, careful work, but it was important. Every blanket, tunic, mitten, or sock started with someone sitting near the fire, twisting wool into thread. The rhythm of spinning and the sound of the wheel helped fill the silence of long winter nights. The Vikings weren't trying to be fashionable. They just wanted to stay warm. Every thread they spun was another layer between themselves and the deadly cold outside. Storytelling was another big part of winter life. The Vikings didn't have books or television, but they had sagas. Sagas were long. They told stories about gods, heroes, battles, and adventures. These stories were passed down from generation to generation. They were memorized and told out loud, often by the fire at night. Each storyteller would add their own twist or extra detail to make the tale more exciting. Maybe Thor didn't just kill the giant, maybe he knocked down a mountain with his hammer, too. The stories were meant to teach lessons, entertain the listeners, and keep people connected to their culture. Everyone knew these tales, and children grew up listening to them night after night. The sagas were also full of humor. Vikings liked to laugh, even in the darkest times. They made jokes, teased each other, and turned embarrassing moments into funny stories. If you tripped over a goat or spilled soup on your tunic, someone would turn it into a joke. This rough humor helped people feel better, even when everything seemed cold and hopeless. Games were another way to stay busy. The Vikings played board games like Nefertafel, which was kind of like chess, but more complicated and sneaky. The game had two sides, one trying to escape, the other trying to trap. It required strategy and patience. Vikings also played dice games using carved bone or stone dice. These games involved luck, bluffing, and sometimes betting. Some people made up riddles to challenge each other's minds. When people got really bored, they wrestled. Wrestling inside a longhouse was risky, but it helped release energy and created funny moments unless someone crashed into the stepot or knocked over the goat. While all these activities kept people busy, mead made everything more fun, or at least more tolerable. Mead was a drink made from fermented honey. It was sweet, strong, and gave people a warm feeling on the coldest nights. Drinking mead helped loosen tongues, made stories funnier, and helped people relax. It also made crafting a little messier and family arguments a bit louder, but that was just part of winter life. A little alcohol helped dull the harshness of reality and made the long nights feel shorter. Even with all their activities, the most powerful Viking survival tool was their mindset. The Vikings expected life to be hard. They didn't sit around wishing for better weather. They knew winter was coming, and they prepared for it like they were preparing for battle. Cold, hunger, and boredom weren't surprises. They were part of the plan. If you expected everything to be miserable, then nothing could disappoint you. This attitude helped them survive. They didn't see suffering as failure, they saw it as strength. When things were really bad, they didn't complain. They joked, they worked, and they carried on. A Viking might say, "It's cold, but at least I'm not being taxed by the king." That was their kind of humor. This tough mindset wasn't just a cultural thing, it was also spiritual. Viking myths were full of gods and giants battling in endless winters. One myth spoke of Fimbulwinter, a never-ending winter that would come before the end of the world. If you grew up hearing stories like that, a few months of snow didn't scare you. Even the gods had to suffer and fight. Life was hard for everyone, even Odin. So if a Viking stubbed their toe, burned their hand, or lost their cheese in the fire, they didn't cry. They told a joke, made a face, and moved on. In Viking communities, people helped each other. You couldn't survive winter alone, no matter how tough you were. Even if you had the best cloak, the warmest boots, and the strongest walls, you still needed your neighbors. Viking villages were built around families and close allies. People shared food, helped repair roofs, and took care of each other's animals. If someone got sick, others brought herbs or warm drinks. If a house ran out of firewood, the whole village pitched in. This wasn't just about kindness, it was about survival. If one family failed, the whole group could suffer. More people alive in winter meant more people helping in spring. So even if you didn't like your cousin, you still shared your dried fish with him. The Viking leaders were also expected to help. Local chieftains or religious leaders didn't just make laws, they made sure people had what they needed. A good leader helped organize food storage, firewood gathering, and even dispute solving. If someone hoarded food or refused to help with chores, the whole village would judge them. In Viking society, being selfish was almost as bad as being dead. You might survive one winter alone, but not the next. Teamwork was more important than pride. The midwinter feast, Yule, helped strengthen these community bonds. It wasn't just a party, it was a reminder that no one was alone. Everyone ate together, sang together, and told stories together. These shared moments gave people hope. Even if the snow outside was deep and the roof was leaking, inside the longhouse there was laughter, warmth, and maybe even dancing. These moments helped people hold on until spring. Even how Vikings stored food reflected their belief in community. Some villages had shared buildings for storing grain, meat, or smoked fish. If one family ran out, others shared. They didn't do this because they were nice. They did it because they needed each other. No one survived winter alone, and when spring came, they needed every person alive to plant crops, raise animals, and prepare for the next year. Winter wasn't a break, it was a test, and Vikings passed it by helping each other, joking through pain, and preparing for everything. The Viking way of thinking helped them face every challenge. If the wind blew the roof off, they patched it with moss. If the soup was too thin, they added a turnip. If the nights felt endless, they filled them with stories and games. They didn't have modern tools, but they had creativity. No waterproof jacket, make one from sheep gut. No antidepressants, tell sagas and roast your cousin with a clever insult. They didn't just survive winter, they used it to get stronger. Children were trained during winter, weapons were fixed, new ideas were shared around the fire. When spring finally came, Vikings didn't crawl out weak and broken. They stepped outside ready to work, build, and explore. Winter didn't crush them, it sharpened them. Their strength didn't come from magic. It came from wool, fire, family, and a lot of stubbornness. Whether it meant sleeping next to a farting goat, eating sour dairy, or steaming themselves like vegetables in a sauna, the Vikings did whatever it took, and most importantly, they did it together. In the Viking world, survival was not about doing everything alone. The cold, dark winters of Scandinavia made that impossible. No matter how tough you were, you couldn't make it through the frozen months without help. That's why Viking society was built on community. People didn't live far apart. They lived in small villages or farms close together, often with extended families and trusted allies nearby. When winter arrived, this close network became your safety net. If someone needed food, others shared. If your firewood ran out, your neighbors brought more. If your roof started to fall apart under the weight of snow, the whole village helped fix it. This wasn't just kindness, it was common sense. Helping others helped you. The more people that survived the winter, the more people there were in the spring to work the land, defend the village, and take care of animals. The group was stronger than the individual. This sense of duty and cooperation was not optional. It was expected. If someone refused to share food or didn't help with chores, the community noticed, and Viking communities had their own form of just as public judgment. Being judged and shamed by your neighbors was often worse than punishment. It meant you couldn't be trusted, and in Viking life, trust was everything. During the winter months, people relied on one another for almost everything: firewood gathering, water collection, feeding animals. Watching over children, these tasks were often shared. Even if you were in a bad mood or didn't get along with someone, you still helped. Everyone understood that survival came first. Arguments could wait until spring dawned. Viking leaders played a big part in this community life. Local, chiefs or religious leaders, called Godi, were not just in charge of making decisions, they were expected to lead by example. A good leader helped organize food storage, made sure no one was left out, and settled disputes fairly. If a leader was greedy or selfish, they quickly lost respect. People followed leaders who looked out for everyone, not just themselves. In return, leaders were treated with honor and given support. They didn't lead with fear, they led with wisdom and action. Food storage was another important part of surviving winter together. In many Viking settlements, food wasn't just kept in individual homes. There were shared storage buildings for grain, smoked fish, meat, and cheese. If one family ran out of supplies, others pitched in. No one wanted a neighbor to freeze or starve, because that could bring down the whole community. Helping each other wasn't a choice, it was a survival plan. Even during midwinter feasts like Yule, this sharing was seen as both celebration and support. People brought what they could to the feast, and no one was left out. These events were fun, but they also reminded everyone that they were not alone in facing the cold and the dark. Inside the longhouse, daily life was centered around routines. The fire had to stay lit, animals had to be fed and milked, children needed to be kept warm, meals needed to be cooked, even if the ingredients were limited. People took turns handling these chores. Women, men, and older children all worked together. There were no lazy days. Even on the darkest, coldest mornings, someone had to brave the outside to check on the livestock. The rest might stay inside, spinning wool, patching clothes, or making tools. When the work was done, people sat together by the fire to talk, eat, and share stories. For children, winter was both hard and educational. It was a time to learn skills they would need for life. Boys learned how to use tools, sharpen knives, and feed animals. Girls learned how to spin wool, mend clothing, and cook simple meals. They all learned how to survive. There was little time for play, but that didn't mean there was no fun. Children joined in on storytelling, sang along with songs, and even helped make up jokes. They were taught that life was tough, but that didn't mean it had to be joyless. Even simple things like learning how to build a snow shelter or walk on icy paths were useful lessons. The Vikings believed in being prepared. They didn't sit around hoping the winter would be mild. They assumed it would be brutal, and they planned for it. Before the snow came, they gathered as much firewood as possible. They dried and stored fish and meat. They made sure their homes were patched and warm. They repaired their clothing and sharpened their tools. By the time the first snowflake hit the ground, they were ready. They weren't hoping for comfort. They were hoping for survival and doing everything they could. To make it happen, Vikings also believed in signs and traditions. They watched the weather, the stars, and even the behavior of animals to guess how hard the winter would be. If the birds left early or the snow came before harvest was done, they knew they were in for a long, hard season. They told stories about old winters that were so cold the sea froze solid, and they used these tales to remind each other to be ready. Some rituals and customs were performed before and during winter to bring luck and protection. People lit special fires, made offerings to the gods, and even wore charms to keep sickness and hunger away. Even with all their toughness, Vikings sometimes had to make difficult choices. If food was low, they rationed. Everyone got smaller portions. If an animal was sick or old, it might be slaughtered earlier than planned. Nothing went to waste. Bones were used for tools, skins for clothing, and meat for food. They were careful with everything they had. A wasted item could mean the difference between life and death. They saved fat to make candles and soap. They reused every scrap of cloth. They even used ashes from the fire for cleaning. Waste was not allowed. In the hardest winters, when nothing went right, the community had one final defense: each other. When all else failed, they gathered closer, shared more, and relied on their bond. Warmth wasn't just from fire, it was from people. They didn't let anyone go through the season alone. If someone was sick, they were cared for. If someone was grieving, they were comforted. If someone had nothing left, others gave what they could. This strong sense of togetherness is what made Viking communities so powerful. Their strength wasn't just in weapons or ships, it was in their hearts and hands. And as spring approached, signs of hope returned. Snow melted. The sun stayed up longer. Birds returned. Children laughed again. People stepped outside with plans, ready to fix what had broken and prepare for the next season. The ice was still on the rivers, but the worst had passed. They had made it, tired, hungry, and maybe still coughing from the smoke, but alive. They were ready to plant crops, build new boats, and live their lives again. Winter hadn't defeated them, it had tested them, and they had passed. Looking back, Viking survival wasn't just about warm clothes or thick walls. It was about mindset, teamwork, and endless determination. They accepted hardship and learned to smile through it. They found joy in laughter, peace in storytelling, and strength in sharing. The cold couldn't take that away. That's why they made it through, year after year, generation after generation. They didn't just survive winter, they conquered it together. As spring slowly returned to the Viking lands, the snow began to melt, and the days grew longer. The ground, once frozen hard, started to soften. Streams flowed again, birds returned, and patches of green began to show through the white. For the Vikings, this change didn't mean rest, it meant the start of a new kind of work. The long, quiet winter had been about staying alive. Now, spring meant rebuilding, planting, and getting ready for the busy months ahead. The moment the weather allowed it, people went outside to fix what the winter had damaged. Roofs had to be repaired. Fences needed mending. Tools were brought out, and everything was cleaned, patched, or rebuilt. Farms were the heart of Viking survival. Every Viking family was connected to the land in some way. Some had big farms with lots of animals and crops. Others had small plots and a few sheep or goats. No matter the size, farming was critical. In spring, the soil had to be prepared. People used simple wooden tools to break up the earth and plant seeds. There were no machines. Only hard labor and teamwork. Men, women, and even children helped. Everyone had a role to play. Barley, rye, and oats were common crops. These grains grew well in a cold climate, were used for bread, porridge, and ale. Beans and turnips were also planted. Every bite of food grown meant one more chance of making it through the next winter. Animals also needed attention. The cows, pigs, sheep, and chickens that had spent winter inside were moved back outdoors. They needed space to roam, grass to eat, and fresh water. Spring was the time for birthing. New lambs and calves were born, bringing hope and new life after months of cold. These baby animals weren't just cute, they were valuable. They would grow up to provide meat, milk, wool, and labor. Taking care of them was a top priority. If a cow got sick or a lamb was lost to wolves, the whole village felt it. Vikings didn't waste anything. If an animal died, every part of it was used. Meat was eaten or dried for later. The skin was cleaned and turned into leather. The bones were made into tools or jewelry. Even the hooves and fat were used for glue, candles, or soap. Nothing went to waste because everything had value. The land was treated the same way. Trees were cut down carefully. Firewood was gathered and stacked for the next winter. People didn't take more than they needed. They knew the earth had the last. Spring also brought travel. During winter, the seas were too dangerous for Viking ships. But once the ice melted and the weather improved, it was time to sail. Some Vikings traveled to trade. They loaded ships with goods like wool, cheese, soap, and dried fish. They sailed to nearby towns or even across the sea to other countries. In return, they brought back silver, spices, fabrics, and tools. Trade was important. It gave Viking families things they couldn't make themselves. Other Vikings traveled for different reasons. Some went exploring, some went raiding. These journeys were risky, but they brought wealth, adventure, and sometimes land. Shipbuilding often began in spring. If a boat was damaged or worn out, it had to be repaired or replaced. Viking ships were strong, fast, and made from carefully chosen wood. Building them took skill and teamwork. It was a point of pride to have a good ship. A well-built boat could carry goods, warriors, or families across great distances. It was both a tool and a symbol of power. Young boys often watched and helped during shipbuilding, learning the skills they would need as adults. Shipbuilders were respected, and their work was trusted. With travel and trade also came stories. People who had spent the winter apart now shared news, tales, and laughter. These gatherings were full of excitement. Everyone wanted to know what had happened while they were snowed in. Who survived? Who got married? Who had a baby? Did the neighboring village lose their roof in the storm? These stories were told with big gestures and loud laughs around fires and feasts. They helped people reconnect and feel part of something bigger. Spring was also a time of new relationships. Young people who had spent winter under the watchful eyes of parents now had more freedom. Festivals and gatherings gave them a chance to meet, talk, and even fall in love. Marriages were sometimes arranged, but many couples met on their own. A shared joke or song could lead to something more. Love was not just about feelings, it was about survival. A good partner was someone who could work hard, help with chores, and raise strong children. Couples formed quickly, especially after. A hard winter reminded everyone how short life could be. Religious practices also returned to full strength in spring. The Vikings believed in gods who controlled nature. When winter ended, they gave thanks. Offerings were made to Thor, Freyr, and other gods. People sacrificed animals, gave gifts of food, or lit fires in their honor. These rituals were done to show respect and to ask for good harvests, healthy animals, and safety at sea. Religious leaders played a big role during these times. They led prayers, explained signs, and reminded people of the stories of the gods. Religion was not separate from life, it was part of everything. The weather, the crops, the animals, even the stars in the sky, all were believed to be messages from the gods. Children were taught these stories early. They learned how Thor used his hammer to fight giants. They learned how Odin gave up an eye for wisdom. These stories weren't just fun. They taught values like bravery, sacrifice, and honor. During spring, children spent more time outside. They played games that helped them learn survival skills like wrestling, throwing stones, and chasing animals. Boys practiced with wooden swords or bows. Girls practiced cooking, spinning, and taking care of younger siblings. Childhood wasn't easy, but it was full of learning. Every task was preparing them for the future. The spring also brought time for community projects. Villages might build new homes, expand fences, or repair paths. These jobs were done together. Everyone helped, from the youngest, who carried water, to the oldest, who gave advice. There was a strong sense of pride in building something with your neighbors. These projects were not only useful, they brought people closer. Jokes were told, songs were sung, and stories were shared while people worked. No one was too important to help. Even the chieftain could be seen lifting stones or carrying supplies. Everyone working together made the community stronger and more united. The longhouse, which had protected everyone during the winter, was often repaired or cleaned in spring. The smoky walls were wiped, the straw floors were replaced, tools were hung in the right place, and supplies were restocked. After months of dark and smoke, people wanted their homes to feel fresh again. It was like taking a deep breath after holding it all winter. Windows, if they had them, were open. Blankets and cloaks were aired out. It was time to let the sun back in, both in the home and in the heart. Vikings knew that peace didn't last forever. Spring and summer were seasons of growth, but they were also the only chance to prepare for the next winter. Everything they did, from planting seeds to fixing boats, was about surviving the future. They didn't waste time. Every task had a purpose. Every day was a step toward security. If they worked hard now, they could rest easier when the snow returned. This way of thinking, always planning ahead, always staying ready, is what made Viking life so strong. The return of spring didn't mean the end of danger. Storms could destroy crops. Disease could strike livestock. Enemies could attack. But the Vikings faced it all with the same mindset they used in winter: toughness, teamwork, and hope. They trusted each other, their gods, and their ability to keep going. After all, they had already faced the darkness and survived. Now they had light, warmth, and each other. As the days continued to grow longer and warmer, Viking life picked up speed. The air was fresh. The sun stayed high in the sky, and the land came back to life. This was the season of endless work. Spring and summer gave the Vikings a short window to gather everything they needed to survive the next winter. Every hour counted. There was food to grow, animals to raise, tools to craft, and ships to prepare. But even with all this hard work, there was a feeling of joy. The light had returned. After months of darkness and cold, people felt alive again. Farming was one of the most important tasks during this time. Families worked from sunrise to sunset, preparing the soil, planting seeds, and tending to crops. They didn't have fancy machines. They used wooden plows, hand tools, and sometimes animals to help break the earth. It was hard, physical work, but it was necessary. If the crops failed, winter would be deadly. The most common crops were grains like barley and rye, which were used to make bread, porridge, and ale. These grains grew well in cold climates and were tough enough to survive poor weather. Turnips, beans, and cabbage were also grown. These vegetables lasted a long time when stored properly and added variety to their meals. The Vikings were smart about food. They didn't just grow what tasted good, they grew what could be preserved. During summer, families dried herbs and berries, made butter and cheese, and stored food in underground pits or stone cellars to keep it cool. Every piece of food saved was like money in the bank. Nothing was wasted. Even leaves and roots were used in soups or as animal feed. If a deer was hunted, the meat was salted, smoked, or dried. The skin became clothing. The bones were turned into tools or jewelry. If fish were caught, they were cleaned and hung to dry in the sun. Vikings also used fermentation to preserve vegetables and dairy. They didn't know the science, but they knew it worked. The food smelled strange and tasted sour, but it kept people alive when snow covered the ground. Animals also needed care during these warmer months. Cows, sheep, pigs, goats, and chickens were raised for food, milk, wool, and eggs. They were fed carefully, watched closely, and sometimes moved between grazing areas. Shepherds often took animals high into the hills where the grass was better. These summer pastures were shared by communities, and they were vital for feeding livestock. Young boys and girls sometimes stayed there for weeks, living in small huts and caring for the animals. It was a hard life, but also a rite of passage. They learned responsibility, bravery, and how to be self-sufficient. Wool was an important product, especially from sheep. It was collected by shearing the sheep with sharp knives. The wool was then cleaned, spun into thread, and woven into cloth. This process took a lot of time and patience. Every family needed warm clothing for winter, and every thread counted. Women and children worked long hours spinning wool and weaving it on large wooden looms. The sound of spinning wheels and weaving tools was common in Viking homes. Wool was used for everything: shirts, cloaks, socks, mittens, and even blankets. It was their best defense against the cold. Some families also dyed their wool using plants and minerals. Reds, blues, and greens showed off skill and status. Bright clothing was rare and prized. Meanwhile, the men were often busy building and repairing boats, Viking ships were famous across Europe. They were fast, flexible, and strong enough to cross seas and rivers. Shipbuilding was a team effort. The best wood was chosen from oak trees and shaped using axes and knives. No nails were used instead. Wooden pegs and clever joining methods held everything together. The design allowed the boats to glide through water with speed and ease. These ships were not just used for war, they were used for trade, travel, and exploration. Owning a ship meant freedom. With a good boat, you could cross the sea, find new lands, bring back goods, and return with stories no one else had heard. It was every young Viking's dream. Trade was another big part of Viking life. When the sea became calm and the winds were good, Viking traders set off with goods to sell. They carried wool, fish, cheese, soap, and carved items. In return, they brought back silver, glass, silk, spices, and sometimes even books or ideas. These journeys took them to places like England, Ireland, France, and beyond. The Viking world was more connected than people think. While many were warriors, just as many were clever traders who built strong relationships with foreign lands. Trade made Viking communities richer not just with goods, but with knowledge. Back at home, summer was also a time for social gatherings. With the sun out and the work in full swing, people came together to celebrate, feast, and hold markets. These gatherings were full of laughter, stories, games, and music. People sold their goods, shared meals, and made deals. It was a chance to see friends, find a spouse, and enjoy life after the darkness of winter. Music was played with flutes, drums, and stringed instruments. Dancers moved to the rhythm, and children ran between the booths. Even chieftains came out to show support, settle arguments, and give speeches. These events reminded everyone that life was not just about survival, it was about connection and joy. Legal matters were also handled during the warm months. Viking society had its own legal system called the Thing. The Thing was a public court where free people gathered to solve disputes, pass laws, and make community decisions. It was held outdoors, often near a sacred tree or stone. Everyone had the right to speak. If the families argued over land or someone accused another of theft, the Thing was where the matter was settled. Witnesses spoke, leaders gave advice, and a judgment was made. Punishments could range from paying fines to being banned from the village. The Thing was serious, but it also helped keep peace. People respected the system because it gave them a voice. It showed that even in a rough world, there were rules and justice. As summer moved on, the work didn't slow down. In fact, it got even more intense. The harvest had to be prepared. This meant checking the crops, sharpening tools, and getting storage areas ready. If the weather turned bad, crops could be ruined, so timing was everything. Families worked side by side, cutting, collecting, drying, and storing everything. Grain was gathered and threshed to separate the seeds. Vegetables were pulled from the soil and packed in barrels or pits. Fruits were dried or turned into jam or wine. The whole community helped. Even elders who couldn't work the field still cleaned, sorted, or gave advice. Food was stored in clever ways. Underground pits were lined with straw and sealed with clay or stones to keep food cool. Some homes had raised storage huts to keep rodents away. Smoked meat was hung in high rafters, out of reach of animals. Butter and cheese were kept in jars and buried. Every bit of space was used. The goal was simple: save enough food to survive another winter. If you worked hard in the summer, you had a better chance of resting in the cold months ahead. But even in all this work, there was beauty. The sun painted the fields gold. Children laughed as they chased each other through the grass. Songs were sung during chores. Couples stole moments together in the shade of trees. Life was hard, but it was full. And for Vikings, that fullness came from working with nature, not against it. They respected the seasons, learned from the land, and used their time wisely. Nothing was taken for granted. Every harvest, every boat, every woven cloak was a sign of victory over the cold dot by the end of summer. The days started to shorten again. A chill returned to the air. People began to speak about winter, not with fear, but with focus. It was time to count supplies, fix roofs, and prepare firewood. The cycle was starting again. But the Vikings didn't dread it. They had faced it before, and they would face it again with wool, fire, family, and stubborn strength. As autumn arrived, the Viking world began to slow down again. The bright summer days faded into cooler winds and shorter daylight. Leaves turned yellow and brown, and birds started to leave the skies. This change in season was not a time for sadness, it was a signal. The Vikings understood what came next. Winter was returning, and even though they had faced it many times before, they never took it lightly. Autumn was the final chance to prepare. Every hour was used wisely. The fields had to be cleared, tools stored, animals moved, and food counted. It was a race against time, and the Vikings knew the rules well. Harvesting was the top priority. Every last crop needed to be gathered before frost ruined it. Men, women, and children all worked together in the fields, cutting grain, pulling vegetables, and sorting everything by hand. It was tiring, dirty work, but the success of the harvest often decided how well a family would survive the winter. If the crops were good, they could rest easier. If the harvest was poor, the whole village would have to make tough choices. People helped each other. A neighbor with too much might trade with someone who had too little. No one wanted to see another go hungry, because next year it could be them. After the harvest, food was stored in cellars, pits, jars, and sacks. It was hidden in every corner of the home under benches, behind doors, and in crates. Drying, salting, and fermenting were used again to make food last. Meat from animals slaughtered in autumn was smoked or hung in the rafters. Cheese and butter were sealed in clay pots. Grain was kept in thick sacks and guarded against moisture and rats. Even apples, onions, and herbs were laid out to dry on racks. Autumn was a time of gathering, but also of sorting and checking. If anything spoiled, it could ruin an entire meal later. Nothing could be left to chance. Firewood was also extremely important. A Viking home could not survive without heat. Every family collected wood all summer, but autumn was when the final loads were brought in. Wood was chopped, stacked, and covered to keep it dry. Some was stored inside the house, while larger piles were left outside under straw or turf. The best woods burned hot and slow. Pine and birch were common. If someone had no trees nearby, they used driftwood or even dried animal. Dung, it smelled bad, but worked in a pinch. Having enough firewood was as important as having food. No fire meant no cooking, no warmth, and no light. It meant death died as supplies were gathered. Viking homes were made winter ready. Leaky roofs were patched with turf or straw. Walls were checked for gaps and stuffed with moss or wool. Doors were reinforced, and animals were brought closer to the home. Sometimes the animal area was cleaned and covered in fresh hay to prepare for winter living. Tools were cleaned, oiled, and hung up where they could be reached quickly. People checked their clothes, fixing torn cloaks, replacing worn-out shoes, and making sure each family member had enough layers to survive the freeze. Children helped too. Even the youngest could carry small bundles of sticks or sweep out the storage area. Older children learned how to repair simple tools or care for animals. These tasks weren't optional. Every helping hand mattered. Children also gathered wild herbs, nuts, and berries while they still could. These small foods were used in medicine, cooking, and even as trade goods. Some families sent people into the forest to hunt one last time before snow made it impossible. Every rabbit, bird, or deer caught in autumn was a gift from nature. It meant one more meal for someone in the family died as days grew colder. People also began to say goodbye. Those who had sailed away for trade or raids needed to return before the sea froze. Families waited at the shore, hoping to see their sons, husbands, or brothers come home. Not every boat made it back. The sea was cruel, and many were lost. But for those who returned, there were hugs, laughter, and heavy bags of goods. A single chest of silver or spices could change a family's life. These returning men brought more than just treasure. They brought stories of far-off lands, strange foods, and new customs. Around the fire, they told tales of giant waves, foreign, kings, and dangerous battles. Children listened wide-eyed, elders smiled quietly. These stories were more than entertainment. They were proof that the Viking world stretched far and wide. Back home, leaders prepared for the hard months ahead. Chieftains made sure that no one was forgotten. They checked off families, gathered extra supplies, and made plans for emergencies. If someone's house burned down or their food spoiled, the community had to step in. People were told to come to the longhouse if they needed help. At the same time, rules were repeated: no stealing, no hoarding, no violence. Viking justice was still strong in winter. Anyone who broke the rules risked being cast out, and in winter, exile was worse than death. Everyone had to follow the same plan: work together, share what you had, and survive. Before winter truly began, people held final festivals. These were smaller than the summer markets, but just as important. They were a chance to say goodbye to the sun. Food was shared, songs were sung, and stories were told late into the night. Bonfires were lit, and people danced in the cold air. Some gave offerings to the gods, asking for protection, health, and strength. Others whispered wishes into the fire or wore charms to bring luck. These gatherings weren't just parties, they were fuel for the soul. They gave people one last moment of warmth and joy before the darkness returned. And then, as snow began to fall and the winds turned sharp, the world slowed down once more. The longhouses were sealed shut. Fires were lit. Animals were brought inside. The community shrank into itself. Outside, everything was white, frozen and still. Inside, the smell of smoke, stew, and wool filled the air. People wrapped themselves in cloaks, lay close to one another, and prepared to face the storm again. But this time, they were ready. They had worked, planned, and helped one another. They had food in the cellars, firewood in the stacks, and laughter in their hearts. They had stories to tell, songs to sing, and jokes to carry them through. The cold could knock on their doors, but it would not break them. They were Vikings. They knew how to face the darkness, not with fear, but with fire, fur, and family. And so, as the snow piled high and the wind howled outside, the Vikings did what they always did. They sat by the fire. They shared stew. They teased each other. They fixed tools, spun wool, and sharpened blades. They taught their children. They remembered their gods. And they waited for spring, for light, for the chance to begin again. Their way of life was not easy, but it was strong. They didn't just survive winter. They made it part of who they were. And because of that, they endured. Year after year, century after century, the spirit of the Vikings burned on like a fire in the heart of a longhouse. Deep in the cold, still night,